wasn't actually a patriarch or a king. 10 children, even Jacob only had 2 more. Thousands of sheep, camels, oxen, donkeys, bunches of servants. Job was, we're told, the greatest of all the people in the East. The abundant life. At least the abundant life as we might conceive it to be. Except that he worked for it all, and we might just like to win the Mega Millions lottery. His accumulation was enough to allow him to do pretty much whatever his little heart desired. The abundant life, this just might be it. Not only that, there's a spiritual part of it too. Job had not gotten that way by insider trading or sheep stealing. He was blameless and upright. He feared God and turned away from evil. Not only that, he made sacrifices on behalf of his children just in case one of them might have made a mistake and cursed God. It sounds like Job had it made in the shade. All he needed was a summer home in beautiful San Fernando Valley, and he'd have paradise on earth. So you can imagine how the early readers of this account, and it dates somewhere probably about to 600 BC, you can see how they would not really appreciate what happened next. Chapter 1 continues. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Satan here translates the word accuser, not yet the fallen angel. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro upon the earth, from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Jacob fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he'll curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, all that he has is in your power, only do not stretch your hand out against him." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. One day when the sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans made a raid on the camels and carried them off and killed the servants. I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine, and suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. Can't get any worse, can it? Sure it can. Here's what happens then. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? He still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason." Then Satan answered the Lord, skin for skin, all that people have, they will give to save their lives. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well, he is in your power, only spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Job took a potsherd from which to scrape himself and sat among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Let's leave it here for a second. You know Job gets a bunch of advice from 3 alleged friends. We'll consider some of that advice later. But this all sounds terrible, and it's supposed to. It's framed as a little conversation that God and Satan have concerning just how good a man Job really is. God is clearly pleased. Here's a man who has prospered, but doesn't forget his faith. He even atones for possible sins by his children. Very impressive. But Satan says, sure, you've protected him. You've got his back. Tell you what, take that away, and he'll curse you. So Satan uproots the fence of wealth and status. But surprise, Job does not lose his faith. Let's say that would be enough to make anyone doubt. Job clearly is an extraordinary man. Then Satan says, probably correctly, that people will trade anything for their health. From reports in the media, lots of people are forced to do that 2,000 years later. Take away his health, Satan says, and that will do it. But in fact, that doesn't do it. Job does not sin. So let's think about Job and suffering. Job has become a symbol of suffering, actually. To refer to the trials of Job is to consider going from everything one could possibly want to nothing at all. Does Job know about suffering? Do we? Clearly, any careful scanning of our favorite news website, not to mention the morning newspaper, will reveal reports of people suffering all over the place, from natural causes like fires, earthquakes, monsoons, snowstorms, to those of more human origin like runaway trains, restaurant bombings, drunk drivers, and urban violence. And it makes you wonder, does this torrent of suffering ever let up? And if not, can one possibly find any point, any redemption in it? This is a good part of what the book of Job talks about, and it ought to. Wise men in every tradition tell us that suffering brings clarity, illumination. Buddhists understand suffering as the first rule of life. And insofar as some of it arises from our own wrong-headedness, our cherishing of self, we have the cure for it within, they say. Thus, in certain cases, suffering can be an effect as well as a cause of taking ourselves too seriously. For some of the devout of all faiths, suffering is a privilege. It can focus our thinking about essential things and shakes us out of short-sighted complacency. Suffering is, in this view, the original hidden blessing, although perhaps not one we particularly like receiving. Most of us would probably pray truthfully, "O Lord, keep me happy in my ignorance." Let me dispose of 4 quick points. First, can it really be a blessing for those who appear to be innocent? Job is painted that way. But we just as easily could have chosen to say a child born with AIDS. We know that neither theology nor philosophy can cure a migraine And the person who starts going on about suffering's long-term benefits might just induce a headache in the listener. Second, anyone who's been close to a loved one suffering from depression knows that the vicious cycle behind that condition means that by definition, your friend or relative can't hear the logic or reassurances we extend. If they could, they wouldn't be suffering from depression. Third, occasionally it's true, I'll meet someone who tends to make the same mistake again and again, heedless of what friends and sense tell him, unable even to listen to himself, and then he crashes the car, suffers a stroke, and suddenly the alarm goes off in his head. Packing a punch that no gentler means can, and suffering will stop him in his tracks, move him to change his ways. And fourth, I need to say that sometimes suffering can be in the eye of the beholder. The paraplegic asks you not to extend sympathy to her. She's happy, even if her pain is more visible than yours. The man on the street in Calcutta, India, or Port-au-Prince, Haiti, can overturn all of our simple notions about the relation of terrible conditions to cheerfulness and energy, and it asks whether we haven't just brought our own ideas of poverty with us. All right, but does that change all the many times when suffering leaves us with no seeming benefit at all, and only a resentment of those who tell us to just look on the bright side? Hey, count your blessings. Or time heals all wounds, when we know sometimes it doesn't. None of us expects life to be easy. And Job isn't asking for that. All he really wants is an explanation for this deluge of disaster. To live, as Nietzsche and others had it, is to suffer. To survive is to make some sense of the suffering, or at least to make peace with its reality. Maybe that's why survival is never guaranteed. Look around. A man by the name of Kobayashi Isu, a haiku master in the 18th century, wrote this: "This world of dew is a world of dew. And yet. His personal life was very much Job-like, but his soul never submitted. He accepted it. He knew that suffering was a fact of life, and he may have been saying as much in his short verse. He knew the impermanence of our earthly lives, and the loss being the law of the world. Although he must have wished, in the face of his own litany of tragedies, that it could be otherwise. But let's admit that suffering is a reality. It's not all in our head or in our heart. Still, unhappiness doesn't have to be our response to it. For some, this may manifest itself as uncomplaining hard work or stoicism. For others, perhaps as a constant sense of the ways difficulty binds us together, as Britain knew during the Blitz, as Japan after the recent tsunami. This is doubly acute among people of real faith who know of their interdependence and that the suffering of one is the suffering of all. For believers, everything is divinely ordained, or at least permitted, including things like tsunamis and cancer and sin. And yet, we live in this world where all of that is not entirely the last word. There is always and still the and yet. I think that the only thing worse than assuming that we could get the better of suffering is imagining we could do nothing in its wake. Maybe when the chips are down and there is suffering right before our eyes, We can be strong enough to witness it without disintegrating, and yet human enough not to pretend to be the master of it. Let me suggest this. Sometimes it's those things we least understand that deserve our deepest trust. This, I think, is what love teaches us. This is what wonder teaches us. This is what faith teaches us. Those things we least understand deserve our deepest trust. What we don't understand about suffering